buried beneath layers of palace protocol and hidden inside a velvet-bound notebook marked only with a gold E, lay the Queen's final assessment, a private reflection no one was meant to see. But when Duchess Sophie stumbled upon this document, the world's perception of the monarchy shifted forever. Why did Elizabeth single out Catherine as the singular future of the crown? And what does this revelation mean for the royal order? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began in quiet, no trumpets, no announcements, just a dusty key and an overlooked drawer in a locked chamber at Windsor. Duchess Sophie had been entrusted with the delicate task of overseeing the private collection of Queen Elizabeth II's personal notes after the monarch's passing. What she expected were ceremonial letters and holiday reflections. What she found instead was a document unlike anything else, bound in royal blue leather, inscribed with a golden E, and marked Private Evaluation, Enduring Line. The tone within was shockingly clinical, detached from the Queen's usual warmth. This wasn't a diary or a letter, it was a reckoning. Sophie paused as she flipped through the pages. There were no embellishments, no flowery praises. Elizabeth had written with precision, categorizing her family not by affection, but by legacy potential. In her hands was the Queen's own internal scorecard, her vision of who was fit to carry the crown into the chaos of modernity. And in that record, one name rose above all others: Catherine. In her calm penmanship, Elizabeth had written, "Above all others stands Catherine, unrivaled in resolve, poise, and loyalty." It wasn't a compliment, it was a designation. Torn between her loyalty to discretion and her instinct for justice, Sophie wrestled in silence for days. Should she bury the document, respecting the privacy Elizabeth had held so dear? Or should she reveal it? As the monarchy staggered under the weight of uncertainty and quiet infighting, the decision gnawed at her. Catherine had no idea of the magnitude of what had been written in her name, and yet, something in Sophie shifted. The world had to know. This wasn't simply a mother-in-law's reflection. It was the closing signature of a sovereign, signaling not just respect, but transfer of symbolic authority. What unsettled Sophie most was the timing. The document was dated weeks before the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, meaning these thoughts had long taken root. Before the pageantry, before the photographs, before the farewells, the Queen had already resolved her final judgment. She saw Catherine not as an extension of William, but as a standalone axis of strength within the fractured royal orbit. There was no mention of Camilla in the upper-tier reflections. William was praised but described as still tethered to hesitancy. But Catherine, she was the only royal the Queen, identified as the balance between past and path. Sophie read the sentence again, over and over. Above all others stands Catherine, unrivaled in resolve, poise, and loyalty. The weight of those 12 words would soon destabilize the monarchy's quiet order. But this revelation was only the beginning. What Catherine didn't know was that this document wasn't merely a personal reflection. It was a trigger one that would set the entire royal hierarchy ablaze. No one imagined that the Queen would ever rank her own family. Yet the document revealed a shocking scoring rubric: discretion, duty, endurance, popularity, and internal influence. In a monarchy obsessed with image, the Queen kept a ledger of souls. And in that quiet calculation, Catherine emerged as something far more than just a future Queen consort. It wasn't just a glowing comment or a stray compliment. The document bore structured evaluation, almost like a report card no one dared expect from a monarch revered for stoic neutrality. Elizabeth had reduced royal performance to 5 brutal metrics: discretion under fire, unwavering duty, endurance against scandal, resonance with the public, and ability to influence the crown's future trajectory from within, not beside. Each name had its own section, and no one was spared. Charles, her eldest and successor, had earned marks for duty but was penalized for temporal stubbornness. Anne, beloved and unswerving, received high marks for endurance and discretion, but was deemed too insulated to inspire the next age. Even Camilla's assessment bore the sharp edge of calculated dismissal. Under the section labelled Influence versus Impact, Elizabeth had written just 5 words: useful in function, not enduring. Camilla's ranking stunned even those within the Queen's inner circle. While she had been formally accepted and publicly dignified, Elizabeth's private reflection made clear the distinction between ceremonial inclusion and core trust. The Queen had seen Camilla as a facilitator, not a pillar. Her strengths were temporary. Her presence, while stabilizing for Charles, would not survive the next storm. But perhaps most shocking of all was the section on William. Expected to be the heir apparent with glowing reviews, William's entry was unsettlingly cautious. He was described as solid but reactive, a man of high potential yet tethered by his own hesitations. The Queen praised his steadiness but questioned his assertiveness in moments of familial fracture. For insiders who had always viewed William as the Crown's inevitable future, the remark was a silent blow. He was respected but not yet fully trusted. And then there was Catherine. With no royal blood, no inherited title, and no formal birthright, she nonetheless dominated the Queen's assessment, not through charm or elegance, but through unshakable resilience, subtle control of narrative, and consistent devotion to role over spotlight. She scored highest in discretion under fire, a reference believed to point toward her quiet handling of internal family feuds, media manipulation, and silent betrayals. Her rating in future-facing empathy was unmatched, a category the Queen marked with a gold asterisk. And beside Catherine's name, written with a firmer pen than anywhere else in the document, were the words, "She is the monarchy's next engine." It was not a metaphor. It was a declaration, a shift from lineage to leadership. A torch passed, not through blood, but through belief. The ripple effect of that single phrase echoed through the palace halls. If Catherine was indeed the engine, then others were mere passengers, and one royal in particular could not bear the destination this document implied. When the existence of the document quietly made its way to Queen Camilla's ears, she did not rage, she plotted. Insiders claim what followed was a series of hushed meetings, shredded letters, and one chilling command. That document must disappear, and so must its weight. But Catherine had already read it, and that changed everything. Camilla's first instinct was disbelief, not because she questioned the document's authenticity, but because the very notion of Elizabeth assigning rankings, especially one that placed Catherine above her, was a direct threat to everything Camilla had built. She had fought too long, endured too much public scorn, and climbed too far to be eclipsed now by a woman she once believed was simply ornamental. But the words were real, and the implication was damning. If Catherine was the Queen's chosen future, then Camilla's reign, no matter how ceremonial, was suddenly cast in shadow. Her response was swift and silent. Within hours of hearing the whispers, a select group of Clarence House staff were summoned for a meeting with no recorded agenda. According to intercepted notes from a palace aide, Camilla initiated what she called a containment protocol, a systematic sweep for any known copies, drafts, or references to Elizabeth's private assessment. What she couldn't erase, she intended to suffocate. But Camilla understood that the real danger wasn't the document itself, it was the people around it. And so began a quiet campaign to undermine Duchess Sophie's credibility. Whispered doubts about Sophie's emotional state, her interpretation of the document, even her loyalty to the crown, began circulating in tightly controlled conversations. Camilla didn't need to discredit the truth. She just needed to tarnish the messenger. Yet it wasn't enough. Catherine had already seen the document. Sophie had ensured that. The Queen's words had taken root, which is why, in a move laced with silent menace, Camilla invited Catherine to a private lunch at Clarence House. There was no agenda, no protocol, just the two women and a silence that spoke volumes. One aide described the encounter as oddly final, as if Camilla was issuing a warning cloaked in pleasantries. She didn't ask Catherine to disavow the document. She didn't even acknowledge its existence. Instead, she reminded her quietly, precisely, that the public only sees what they are allowed to see. Catherine left that lunch, knowing the gloves had come off. Behind the scenes, Camilla turned to Charles, but his response was not what she expected. Though deeply unsettled by the implications of his mother's written words, the king refused to take sides. He viewed the document as Elizabeth's farewell observation, not a royal decree. Yet his silence, his refusal to act, revealed something deeper. Even he feared the weight of what the document now represented. A monarch's final thoughts could shift not only the court's balance, but the people's loyalty. And Charles, ever conscious of legacy, chose hesitation over confrontation. Yet what Camilla didn't expect was that this document had already travelled beyond the royal walls its content had touched, a far older guardian of legacy. Anne, the unshakable sentinel of the monarchy, is said to have read the Queen's assessment in full twice. According to an insider, she placed it in a cedar box once used by Prince Philip and simply whispered, "She got it right." For the first time, Anne took Catherine under her wing not as a royal niece, but as a future sovereign. It was Sophie who first approached Anne, not with intention, but with necessity. The document had crossed a threshold from private reflection to political lightning rod, and if there was one person within the monarchy who could be trusted to read it without theatrics or agenda, it was the Princess Royal. Anne had long been regarded as the institution's spine, the unwavering executor of duty whose loyalty to the Queen was second only to her loyalty to the survival of the monarchy itself. When Anne read Elizabeth's confidential assessment, she made no sound, no visible reaction, but she didn't need to. Those in the room felt the atmosphere change. She did not argue. She did not doubt. In fact, her only question was, "Has Catherine seen this yet?" What followed next was a private meeting between Anne and Catherine, arranged with almost military precision. There was no press, no palace announcement, just an intentional absence of interference. In that quiet room, away from titles and scrutiny, Catherine finally asked the question that had haunted her since reading the Queen's final words. "Do you agree with her?" Anne paused, a long moment stretching into something heavier than silence, and then simply looked away. She never answered, but the absence of denial said more than words ever could. From that point forward, something imperceptible yet seismic shifted in their dynamic. Anne was no longer a detached royal aunt. She had become a silent architect of Catherine's ascent. The turning point came when Anne passed Catherine, an item that few even knew existed, a royal ledger dating back to Queen Victoria. Inside were coded references, notes from previous sovereigns, and annotations passed down only to those deemed essential to the preservation of royal continuity. Anne's words were direct, almost chilling in their precision. "You'll need this soon." There was no warning, no elaboration, just a quiet acknowledgement that Catherine was no longer simply preparing for the future. She was the future. From that day on, Anne's behaviour shifted subtly but unmistakably. She began appearing at events traditionally led by Catherine not as a figure of oversight, but as a gesture of endorsement. No official statements were made, yet her presence alone carried the full weight of royal history. The whispers among staff grew louder. If Anne, the most unyielding of all the royals, was aligning herself with Catherine, then the power dynamic was tilting not ceremonially, but strategically. The monarchy was not waiting for a crown, it was preparing for a pivot. But as the royal women circled around the rising force that was Catherine, another figure had been watching quietly and preparing to act. In a rarely spoken of corridor of royal influence known only as the Chamber of Quiet Loyalties, Prince Edward had long been cataloguing strengths, failures, and heirs of character, not blood. He had suspected Elizabeth was planning something with Catherine, but the document confirmed everything. And now, his role in the unfolding plan could no longer remain silent. For decades, Prince Edward had been underestimated, his quiet demeanour and low-profile approach often misread as passive. But behind closed palace doors, he had become something else entirely. The monarchy's secret archivist, its quiet strategist, and the silent broker of legacy. Within a sealed registry known to only 3 living royals, Edward had been tasked with maintaining what the Queen referred to as succession temperament files. These were not legal documents, nor tied to the official line of inheritance, but rather detailed psychological and behavioral profiles. Elizabeth's long-view assessment of who could truly sustain the crown's weight in the unpredictable decades to come. It was a secret system, rooted not in protocol, but in instinct. And now, with the release of her final assessment ranking Catherine above all, the instincts had crystallized into royal intent. Edward had always known something was coming. The Queen's occasional references to Catherine as a balancer, and her decision to grant the Princess of Wales unprecedented access to royal archives were quiet markers of transition. But it wasn't until he read the confidential assessment buried in Sophie's hands, now burning through the inner walls of Windsor, that Edward understood the scale of it. The wording was deliberate, the structure was clean. The document, in his mind, had not been written to be forgotten. It had been designed as a posthumous detonator, and it had worked. The entire equilibrium of royal order had shifted, and Edward, who had always followed his sister's silent cues, understood it was time to activate his role in the plan she never spoke aloud. His first move was subtle, not public, not performative. He began attending previously unattended briefings held by Catherine. At ceremonial events, his seating proximity quietly changed. Invitations were rerouted. Edward, once peripheral, began orchestrating minor shifts in ceremonial duties, redirecting symbolic roles into Catherine's orbit. From royal correspondence endorsements to appearances traditionally reserved for senior male royals, Catherine began absorbing a new layer of visibility but without noise. It was a transference of gravity, engineered not through decree but through pattern. Behind this strategy lay Edward's unshakable belief that Catherine's role, as Elizabeth had envisioned, went beyond that of a queen consort. She was being positioned as a regent in spirit, an anchor not bound to her husband's rise, but to the monarchy's very survival in the modern age. And the Chamber of Quiet Loyalties, formed decades ago to preserve legacy during times of institutional doubt, was now fully behind her. In whispered meetings with long-standing palace advisors, Edward made it clear. And yet, as Edward maneuvered silently through tradition's corridors, aligning a new order behind Catherine, he could feel the resistance brewing beneath. Because no chain of succession survives unchallenged, and as momentum built around Catherine, a counterforce was being mustered in secret. In the shadows of the York bloodline, Princess Beatrice, long sidelined and overlooked, saw the document not as prophecy, but as insult. Sources reveal a midnight meeting where Beatrice told Eugenie, "If they crown her in spirit, we'll never rise." What followed was a dangerous flirtation with the idea of a symbolic York rebellion, led not by title but by resentment. The Queen's assessment had struck a nerve, and nowhere did it sting more than among the daughters of the disgraced Duke of York. Beatrice and Eugenie, who had spent their lives towing the invisible line between senior and surplus, were not expecting praise, but neither were they prepared for what Elizabeth's words delivered. Their names appeared as little more than administrative notes, footnotes in a broader story, where Catherine loomed not just as a rising consort, but a monarch in waiting by merit alone. For Beatrice, who had fought quietly for legitimacy despite her father's scandalous shadow, the blow was unbearable. She believed in bloodline, in tradition, in the crown's inheritance, by descent, not by admiration. Catherine's rise, sanctioned by the Queen's final penstroke, felt like an erasure. It began subtly. Beatrice started holding quiet dinners unannounced, meetings with once loyal supporters of Prince Andrew's defunct court. These weren't strategy sessions in the traditional sense, they were mood tests. Could there be appetite for resistance, not against Catherine's character, but against the creeping sentiment that merit could override lineage? Her conversations weren't about sabotage, but about sovereignty. And though Eugenie initially joined these gatherings, her discomfort grew quickly. She saw in Beatrice's eyes a gleam of desperation masquerading as defiance. What Eugenie feared most was not Beatrice's ambition, but her willingness to be weaponized by old enemies of the new order. One conversation, in particular, chilled royal aides. During a closed-door meeting, Beatrice reportedly asked a former palace advisor, "Are we to accept that endurance and charm can now supersede royal blood? Are we abandoning royal birthright entirely?" The question wasn't rhetorical, it was a declaration. unsigned but easily traced, was delivered to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The phrasing was carefully veiled, but its implications clear. The spiritual guardians of the monarchy were being asked to consider the consequences of allowing non-blooded elevation without formal boundaries. While the letter was dismissed by officials, it exposed the simmering unrest within the very family it sought to defend. The York strategy became one of soft disruption. Knowing that Catherine's influence was growing but not yet solidified, Beatrice quietly shifted her aim not at Catherine, but at Camilla. If public favour could be stirred against the Queen Consort, if doubts about her influence and propriety could surface, then loyalties within the court might split just enough to halt Catherine's momentum. Divide and dilute, that was the plan. Whisper campaigns, social jabs, sympathetic columnists hinting at the overreach of non-inheriting royals, nothing overt, but everything pointed. Yet, in all of this political manoeuvring, one truth remained untouched. Catherine had not revealed the entire document to the public, nor even to her allies. While internal fractures threatened to derail everything, Catherine herself was grappling with the document's weight and one section she hadn't revealed to anyone else. Alone in Adelaide Cottage, away from the rituals and routines, Catherine sat with the document that had upended her life. She didn't feel victorious, she felt exposed, for within the final paragraph, Elizabeth had left a chilling note. If she fails, the monarchy fractures. And in that line, Catherine felt the unbearable weight of a nation's continuity on her shoulders. She had read the assessment a dozen times, but it was that final paragraph she kept returning to. It wasn't written in the same measured tone as the rest of the document. It was darker, more urgent, almost like a warning written not to inform, but to haunt. Elizabeth had concluded her judgment with a single line that no one else knew about, not even Sophie, not even Anne. She will be tested in shadow, not spotlight. Catherine understood immediately what it meant. The public would adore her, perhaps even revere her, but her true trials would come not with tiaras or televised ceremonies, but in quiet betrayals, invisible pressures, and emotional wars behind closed doors. That prophecy, that shadow test, had already begun. William noticed the shift almost instantly. Catherine, always composed, had grown quieter, more distant. She would lose herself mid-conversation, her gaze slipping to a place he couldn't follow. One night, after their children had gone to bed, he asked her directly, "What aren't you telling me?" And she almost told him, almost unfolded the document and showed him every page. But she didn't. She folded it back into its casing and tucked it beneath layers of private letters. Some truths, she believed, needed to remain unshared, not out of secrecy, but out of protection. If William read the full weight of Elizabeth's expectations, it might paralyze him. And right now, he had to remain free to lead in his own way. Left alone with her thoughts, Catherine's mind wandered back to her earliest days in the royal family. How she always felt watched not just by press or staff, but by history itself. Every smile, every silence, every misstep was measured. Even then, she had sensed something intangible pressing against her expectation without form. Now, she finally understood. Elizabeth hadn't just seen potential. She had been sculpting Catherine silently, testing her through tension, measuring her strength in the silences between scandals. The Queen's quiet mentoring had been happening all along, invisible but intentional. And so, with shaking hands and sleepless nights, Catherine began her own journal. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of reckoning her thoughts on duty, on legacy, on her fears and failures. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "In case I fall too." It was a painful act of self-awareness, but one born of necessity, because if the Queen's document had taught her anything, it was that the weight of the crown could not be carried with illusion. It demanded brutal honesty, even if it came at the cost of peace. But even as Catherine wept in solitude, the monarchy moved forward, and an unexpected announcement would shake the public and palace alike. In a surprising turn, Duchess Sophie emerged at the Women of the Crown Symposium and declared before reporters, "Her Majesty believed in one above all, and I have chosen not to bury her truth." Cameras flashed. Gasps rippled through the room. And with that, the Queen's confidential assessment entered the public domain, triggering headlines, outrage, and an irreversible shift in royal dynamics. For weeks, Sophie had wrestled in silence. The pressure inside the palace had reached a boiling point. Subtle intimidation, warnings wrapped in smiles, and veiled suggestions from senior aides that the document should remain a family matter. But Sophie, ever the loyal confidant of the late Queen, had reached her limit. She had witnessed the quiet mobilization to erase Elizabeth's final thoughts, to suppress what she knew had been intended as a final safeguard for the institution. And so, without informing Clarence House or even her own communications team, she stepped onto that stage and did the unthinkable. She spoke the Queen's truth aloud. "Catherine was chosen," she said, "not for power, but for preservation. And it is time we honor what was meant to endure." The palace press team was caught flat-footed. For 72 hours, they offered no comment, no denial, not even a correction. The silence spoke louder than any royal statement. Meanwhile, the public reaction was immediate and thunderous. Supporters of Catherine surged forward in solidarity, praising Elizabeth's foresight and Sophie's courage. But beneath the celebration, new fault lines formed. Critics began to question the monarchy's inner workings. If such a pivotal document could be hidden, what else was being kept from the people? Questions of succession, merit, and manipulation began swirling in op-eds and late-night debates. And while Catherine remained composed in public, insiders reported she was both overwhelmed and stunned by the magnitude of what Sophie had unleashed. At Clarence House, fury boiled behind locked doors. Camilla was reportedly livid, declaring that Sophie had overstepped every sacred boundary. Charles, though outwardly measured, was said to have threatened the removal of several of Sophie's patronages, an unmistakable message that her defiance would come at a price. But it was too late. The dam had broken, and in its wake, the monarchy was forced to confront a truth it had desperately tried to quarantine. Online, the storm became a movement. Number Elizabeth Knew trended globally within hours. Thousands shared clips of the symposium, framed in black and gold, echoing the Queen's legacy with digital reverence. Royal observers dissected every phrase of the document, now leaked in full, debating Catherine's role, Elizabeth's strategy, and the meaning of sovereignty in a post-Elizabeth age. In the days that followed, Sophie received an anonymous letter, handwritten, delivered through a private courier. It contained no signature, only one line: "Thank you for protecting the Queen's final safeguard." And yet, amidst the chaos, one final revelation remained sealed until the last drawer of the Queen's private vault was opened. Tucked into the back of the leather journal was a loose page, folded 3 times. Dated just months before her passing, it read, "The monarchy is not a lineage, but a legacy, and Catherine is the bridge." With that line, the Queen's intentions were no longer ambiguous. She had made her choice not just of heir, but of saviour. It was a royal archivist who found it, hidden in a slim inner sleeve stitched into the back of the Queen's private journal, a section no one had noticed before. The paper was different, less formal, more intimate, and the handwriting, though slightly shakier than Elizabeth's usual correspondence, was unquestionably hers. The ink had faded slightly, but the words pulsed with clarity and finality. It wasn't an official decree. It wasn't a command. It was something far more potent, a confession of faith, wrapped in foresight. As news of this discovery reached Catherine, she requested to see the letter alone. And when she read it, when she ran her fingers across those final, personal words, "Catherine is the bridge," she wept. Later, she would tell someone close to her, "I felt her hand on my back." And in that moment, the burden that had been haunting her transformed into a calling. Within the letter, Elizabeth elaborated on what palace insiders now call the bridge theory. It was the Queen's quiet belief that monarchies do not survive through heirs alone, but through those rare figures who can link the traditions of the past to the demands of the future. Elizabeth knew that the crown was more than ceremony. It was a living organism that required transformation without collapse. She believed Catherine was that rare figure, not a disruptor, but a connector, someone who could weather generational storms without losing the monarchy's essence. Not born to the throne, but born to carry its weight through transition. When Catherine shared the letter with William, he reportedly sat in silence for a long time, and then, with tears in his eyes, said only one thing: "Now I understand why she always looked at you that way." It was a painful truth recognition that the Queen had long seen in Catherine something even he had overlooked. The strength of quiet revolution, the poise beneath pressure, the grace that endures when applause fades. And for the first time since his mother's death, William felt the presence of a guiding voice return. Only this time, it was speaking through his wife. The final lines of Elizabeth's letter sealed its place in history. "She will weather their storms and carry our peace," it read. It wasn't just a hope, it was a prophecy. And though the nation remained divided across generations, ideologies, and expectations, the monarchy found an unlikely unifier in the woman who had once been labelled simply a commoner, then a duchess, then a consort in waiting. Now, she was something more, the bridge between what was and what must be. And so, with a single document, a queen's whisper became a command-shifting power, allegiance, and the very idea of what it means to rule. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.